Okay, we're going to get started. It's my absolute delight to very briefly introduce our esteemed panelists here today. I'm going to talk as little as I possibly can. But we have assembled here a fantastic group. We have Claire Cramen, who's a professor of conservation biology and faculty director of the Berkeley Food Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, my hometown. Very excited about that. We have Fred Kirschenman coming here from Iowa. He's a distinguished fellow of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State University, and also serves as the president of the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, based in Pocantico Hills, New York, just upstate of Manhattan. We have Shauna Sadowski, who's the director of sustainability at Annie's Incorporated, a very interesting and progressive food company, and William Sutton, who is a lead economist and cluster leader at the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. And moderating the panel will be Bruce Kahn, coming here from New York. He is a portfolio manager, Sustainable Insights Capital Management, and a lecturer in sustainable finance in statistics for sustainability management at Columbia University. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming our panel.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, thank you very much for all the effort you guys have done in the proposal and participating in the Ag Innovation Prize. I think I don't speak for the panelists, but I think I could speak for everybody I've talked to over the course of 2 days, which is very impressive work, and it's really inspiring. And that's what we hope to do in this panel today, is talk a little bit about our impressions from the 2 days, some of the kind of issues that we see in agriculture and agricultural innovation, and that's really what really is motivating us and inspiring us by the work that you guys have done. So, and you're also really getting a great snapshot today of kind of like the ecosystem of what's going on in agribusiness and agriculture, and not dissimilar or disconnected from other systems like energy or other industries, but this is a great microcosm because we have somebody from an international global agency, Bill, from the World Bank. We have a very well established academic researcher in agroecology. We have an actual farmer who actually that was Claire. We have an actual farmer who actually knows how to farm and raise crops and animals. And then we have Shauna, who's actually from a consumer goods company in the agribusiness sector. And then myself, which is kind of like the, what I say, like the fluid that makes it all happen, is the capital markets and how the capital markets actually either promote or thwart agriculture and innovation, and I guess we'll talk more about that. So one of the first issues that we wanted to talk about, which was, we all know that there's a lot of externalities that happen from agriculture. What are they? How do we deal with them? And what are some of the solutions that we should be looking for in these types of projects and in the future? And I'll start with you, Shauna, as a company manager. How are you looking at externalities and building that into your business?
Yeah, great. Well, in terms of I'm looking at things from a sustainability perspective across the life cycle of our products. So that allows for us to really see where our greatest impacts take place. And so when we talk about externalities, I mean, that's, the economist's term for that which is, not included in your typical equation of what we seek to do in a market, which is, drive financial growth. And a lot of times we make decisions and we're not necessarily looking at the full spectrum of impacts beyond those economic impacts. And so it's really looking at environmental and social impacts. And that's obviously a lot of what many of you brought to the table when you were bringing together your projects. And I'm going to give you a specific example of what we've done at Annie's, because within a consumer products company, we want to do what makes the biggest difference. Like for us, Annie's is really about like how can we actually be a business to drive positive change? We're not huge, we're not a multi-billion-dollar company, but we are growing. And it's that kind of mid-sized company that has an opportunity to drive change in a more positive way. So a couple of years ago, we did something called a life cycle assessment. I'm sure many of you are familiar and you've probably done the studies. And we looked specifically at greenhouse gas emissions to see of our entire product portfolio, where are our biggest impacts? Where are those hot spots, if you will? will. And so within that, this is, we have different products. For those of you who don't know, I should probably back up a little bit. So we have mac and cheese with a bunny on it. We have cookies and crackers, cheddar bunnies. We have salad dressings. And so what we did was we did a representative sampling to see where are our greatest impacts. And with that, the biggest drivers for us really come from the wheat and dairy side. And so it was no surprise that looking across all of that, the biggest impacts from the greenhouse gas emissions was at the farm. So more than 40% takes place at the farm, and then it have some smaller impacts going off to the packaging and the manufacturing. So with that, we have the majority of the programs we're doing, actually all of our programs now focused on sustainability are within those three different areas, with a big focus on the farm. I think to further that point on, I wanted to dive deeper though, so what does it mean to have a hotspot on the farm? What does that look like from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective? And that's when you get into what are the farming practices and what impacts are those having on greenhouse gases? And we compared what it was like to look at organic wheat versus conventionally grown wheat. And what we found is that organic wheat, based on the studies that were available, actually have a 40% lower greenhouse gas emissions. And why is that? It's because so much of the greenhouse gases are coming from the fertilizer, energy used to create the fertilizer for synthetic fertilizers that's used in conventional ag. So just by virtue of moving to an organic system, you see that big of a difference. And so I will be the first to say that there's a whole lot more research that needs to be done to help us drive better data. And I know there's some folks in the room who've looked into like dairy and other commodities, and this is something that I'm really keen on getting more information on and supporting research to do. But it's just one example of how you can see an organic system which relies on crop rotations and really focusing on reducing soil erosion and building ecology into the nutrient management plan can actually make a big difference in terms of that quantifiable impact and the externalities.
Thanks, Shauna. That's a great lead-in for you, Claire, I think. She just mentioned, like, to make it more ecologically integrated, can we really get the levels of production we need while simultaneously integrating kind of ecological structure and function metrics to keep it all together?
Right, yes, thanks for that lead-in. I really do believe that we can. I think that often the concern is that, we're going to need to use a lot of pesticides, or we're going to need to use a lot of fertilizers to get yields up and to keep yields up, and that's what many growers believe. It's what much of the populace believes. And so there's a concern if we were to go to methods that don't utilize those heavy doses of chemicals, are we going to lose our productivity? But I think there's other ways to intensify farming besides chemical intensification. And another way to do that is what we might think of as ecological intensification. And that's really building off of all the agroecological mechanisms that we can put in place in a farm using sustainable agricultural techniques. And these techniques generally, in one way or another, rely on diversifying in the farm field itself, around the farm field, and potentially also in the landscape around the farming field. And when we capture those productivity mechanisms that really come from the biological diversity, from the agro-biodiversity on the farm field, then that can lead to really productive situations as well. And just to give you a couple of examples, simple things like utilizing compost, that compost builds the soil organic matter that creates the habitat for all of this important soil biota, from microbes up to earthworms, that are really important in delivering the nutrients to the plant root system, recycling those nutrients, regenerating those nutrients. Another simple technique is something like intercropping and cover cropping, these kinds of things that help to build the communities of beneficial insects that we need on the farm, like pollinators that help to produce larger fruits, more fruits and vegetables, and the beneficial insects that can control crop pests, again leading to productivity increases. So we really need to harness and capture these ecological mechanisms that allow us to be productive at the farm scale. And that's a way that we can get off of the need for lots of chemical inputs that have all these externalities and that are also expensive for growers. And I think a final exciting thing about ecological intensification is it puts more of the control into the farmer's hands. So this can be a really good method for smallholders, such as in the last presentation on TEF, talking very much about these kinds of things. We can really help people who need it most to access these kinds of methodologies. So then it builds their ability to have food security and to have control over that. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So Fred, maybe you could take it from there and tell us, you've been at the forefront of integrating these types of production mechanisms on your own production lands. Tell us, what's your experience been like doing more ecologically oriented production?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things that we need to think about as we think about ag innovations now, I find myself even within the sustainable ag community, we're not ready to think about that a lot, and that is that we have to now begin to think not only in terms of what is operational and sustainable and entrepreneurial in our current situation, in our current economy, but where we're going to be 10 to 20 years from now, because we're about to go through a very significant transformation. Ernest Shusky, who's an anthropologist, wrote about this in a book he published back in 1989 called Culture and Agriculture. And he pointed out, and of course, as an anthropologist, as you would expect, he looked at this from the point of view of how we have fed ourselves as a human species ever since we've been on the planet. And he pointed out that for the first 190,000 years, we fed ourselves as hunter-gatherers. And that was the most, from an energy efficiency point of view, the most efficient food system we ever had. We were getting about 20 kilocalories of food for every 1 kilocalorie of energy that we invested. And then in the Neolithic Revolution, we started to do agrarian agriculture. That made us a little less efficient. We were getting about 10 kilocalories of food for 1 kilocalorie of energy. And then he argues that in the early 20th century, and essentially after the Second World War, we entered into a third era of feeding ourselves, which he called, and I've always loved this term, the neocaloric era, because it's entirely based on old calories. So fossil fuels are old calories, fertilizers are old calories, fossil water are old calories, and we've had blessed with relatively stable climates. So this is the economy and the food and agriculture system that we've all grown up in, that we've gotten used to, and I think we sort of do what Mr. Eagleton, who was the president of the World Watch Institute in the 2013 State of the World report, put it as a dreamy belief that because we're in this notion, we think, well, this is the way things continue to happen, and all we have to do is kind of, tweak things a little bit, make them a little bit better, and then things can be fine and go on. And that's not the future that we're going to be facing. We're going to be facing a future of the end of cheap energy, the end of cheap fertilizers, the end of surplus of fresh water, and the end of stable climates. And so the kind of question we have to start thinking about now, the kind of innovations that we're going to need, is how are we going to create and design the new food system under those new circumstances? And there's very few of us at this point that are addressing that, and 10 to 20 years is not a long period of time to really redesign the system, and that's what we have to do. And that isn't to say that there aren't some things happening which are beginning to move us in that direction. And we, in fact, had one group here that unfortunately weren't one of the winners from my perspective, but that's the Dryland Agroecology Group. And here's a group of innovators who are looking at how to use the ecological resources that nature provides us with to produce our food. That begins to look at self-renewing, self-regulating systems rather than coming up with sexy new technologies to fix it, which are also still going to be dependent on cheap energy and all those other resources. So from my point of view, the kinds of things that we need to do now, and this is especially from my perspective, some point the microbes are going to take over my life and I won't be around anymore. But you all who are a part of this ag innovations effort is the next generation, and this is an issue that's going to be fundamental to your own futures. And we do have some things happening that I find that are very encouraging. One of them is the beginnings of the adoption of farmers now using cover crops in a typical monoculture system. So the way you do this with cover crops is, you still plant corn and soybeans as your monoculture system. You still use the same kind of inputs, but then you incorporate a diversity of cover crops into that system so that, preferably just before you harvest the corn or the soybeans, you spread those cover crop seeds in. So by the time you harvest, your cover crop is already 6 or 8 inches tall. The cover crops then begin to absorb and hold the nutrients in the soil in the plant. And over a period of time, like 6 to 7 years, if you plant these cover crops consistently, it so restores the biological health of soil that farmers can begin to reduce their pesticide and fertilizer input by 70% and still maintain the same yields. And the biological health of the soil gets restored to such an extent that instead of soil only absorbing about a ½ inch of rainwater an hour, which is where most of our soils are now, given that we've not paid attention to that, the soil now begins to absorb over 8 inches of water an hour. Now, when you start to think about the long-term benefits of that in terms of having more self-regulating and self-renewing systems, instead of being dependent on all these old calorie inputs that we've been using in the past, that's a significant direction that we should be thinking about. Now, we also have a number of researchers now that are really looking at perennialization. The Northeast, for example, it used to be almost all trees, and tree crops are perennials. You don't have to plant them every year, and they're very nutritious foods that you can grow from tree crops. So we have some researchers at Rutgers University now, for example, who are really looking seriously at this. How can we begin to think about redesigning the food system in Northeast ecologies in terms of perennial tree crops? And then you have people like Wes Jackson at the Land Institute, who the last 30 years has been working at the development of perennial grain crops. Again, if you're planting a perennial grain crop, you don't have to plant it every year. You have root systems that go 15 to 18 feet into the soil instead of 15 to 18 inches like annuals, provide all of the benefits in terms of soil health from that. So again, there's some very exciting things happening, and it's going to take us some more time, to get where we need to go. But it seems to me that those kinds of agroecological systems are the kinds of systems that we need to begin exploring now. And it's not that we're going to get, some farmers now, even some of the large farmers in Iowa now, are starting to plant cover crops, because if you can cut your fertilizer and pesticide input by 70%, they're interested in that. But even if there are things that don't look attractive now, as the impact of the future that we're moving toward begins to happen, so one of the things the way I like to put it is, let's assume that T. Boone Pickens was close to correct when he said 2 years ago that 10 years from now, which means 8 years from now, we should expect that crude oil will be $350 a barrel. So let's assume it's 20 years from now. At some point it'll get there. And let's assume that fertilizer costs are at least 5 times what they are now, and already they're starting to increase pretty rapidly. And let's assume that our freshwater resources are only half as much as they've been in the past, and that we have twice the number of severe weather events. What do you want to have in the landscape that's, quote, sustainable? Those are the kinds of issues that we need to start addressing with each other. And I would hope that increasingly in our concept of ag innovations, those are the kinds of innovations that we begin to address, because it's especially going to be important to all of you in the next generation. So I think so there are some hopeful things. We have to look at the reality of our future. We have to look at the things that are hopeful. And then, Thomas Berry once said that difficult times are moments of grace, because most of us are not willing to change very much as long as things are working okay. But when things get bad, then we become motivated to really look at the kinds of innovations we need to be looking at.
Well, thank you, Fred. And I think what you're saying is something that you've been saying all morning to me, Shauna, is that the current paradigm of the way we think is we need to produce more, and maybe make it more economic. And certainly from a capital markets perspective, that is definitely the mantra. Where's the growth? We need growth. But what you were saying earlier, Shauna, about maybe that's not the right paradigm. Just producing more is not necessarily producing better. Can you expound on that?
Yeah. This is something I hear a lot in the circles where I go and I attend conferences or speak at, but this notion of we must feed 9 billion by 2050. Because for one, even just that statement itself is very interesting, because it's the idea that we have to feed others. And I personally think that we need to kind of rethink that equation of how do we get people and give them the tools to feed themselves. So it kind of changes the way in which we think about production. But I think, just looking at this whole idea of, the idea of need for growth, if we currently actually produce enough to feed everyone at this point in time, but those people are still hungry and you still have food insecurity, it means there's a flaw in the system itself. So right now, there's just a couple examples. Jonathan Foley's actually written on this quite extensively, and I think he's out of the University of Minnesota, and I really admire his work. But if you have...
He started as a badger, though, by the way.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that. But you have, some of the examples you guys brought to light in the projects is the amount of waste we have. And you have waste here in the U.S. About 40% of food is wasted, mostly at the consumer end. When it comes to developing countries, a lot of that happens at the post-harvest element. But if 1/3 of our food production is being wasted, that's already a huge chunk of food that we could be looking at more closely as to how do we actually keep that in. Secondly, the food that is being produced, where is that food going? Is it going for human consumption? Is it going for animal consumption? Right now, we have a lot of food that's produced that doesn't ever make it to human needs. It goes to animals. And so I think, and then that leads to other components where we have malnutrition on both ends of the spectrum, not just those who don't get enough food, but those who consume too much food and the food that actually leads to obesity, which has other ramifications from a public health standpoint, from cardiovascular disease, heart disease, et cetera. So there are a lot of these components of that I think tie into a very linear way of thinking. We have to just grow, whereas we could actually start to disentangle a little bit of what can we do to, what are the inefficiencies that currently exist, and what can we be doing to change that? That will actually address some of these problems that we're trying to face. And so I think that, for me, has been a huge component of rethinking our food system, and it has different parts that we have to face. I think Fred expounded very well on the whole focus on agroecology. How do we actually manage our land better at the farm level? Then there's the next stage of how food moves from the farm to the various stages before it gets to the consumer, and handling the waste elements that might be occurring there. And then the end one is this idea of the diets that we have, and how are we eating? What kind of diets, where are the majority of your ingredients and the foods that you put into your body, where are they coming from? And the diversity of diet that's needed there. Just as you need diversity of diet for the food, for the crops and what they're doing, we need the same thing for our human bodies to maintain balance. So for me, it's an interesting question of finding balance in the system at all these different stages in the supply chain. And it really starts by addressing inefficiencies and redefining our paradigm of what we deem as success.
Did you want to go ahead? Go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, I'd love to add a few things to what Shauna said. I really liked the way you expressed about, do we need to feed the world, or can the world feed itself? I think that's a really key component, and I've heard the word food security a lot this morning. There's another word that's also really important, and that's the word food sovereignty. And I don't know how many of you might have heard it. I actually have the definition here, so I'll just read it to you. Food sovereignty is the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural system. It develops a model of small-scale sustainable production benefiting communities and their environment. It puts the aspirations, needs, and livelihoods of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. And so that's the notion of being able to use these agroecological methods that are often knowledge-intensive and labor-intensive, but can be very low technology, make those available to people so that they can actually produce their own food. That's really a way to get away from the hunger that we have. Again, the hunger that we have is not because we don't produce enough food, we do, but it's not getting distributed to those, or it's not getting produced by those who need it. So I really think that there are big needs to think in a very transformative way about how to solve these huge issues of food production in the future, hunger, and also these externalities. And then just a final point I want to make is that, again, we often hear that we may need to nearly double food production by 2050. We hear it so often that it's become fixed in our minds that that's what we have to do. But it's important to question the assumptions. Sean has already brought up the issue of how much food we waste. And there's also the issue of the way that we consume that food, that so much of the food we produce now goes to feeding livestock rather than people. And then the conversion from the grain that we use to feed livestock to livestock is so inefficient. So if more of that grain was going directly to feeding people, we wouldn't have nearly the hunger problem that we do. So we need to think about this need to double food production. Well, part of that's coming from increasing population, but that's not a given. That population will become 9 billion by 2050 is not a given. That's a projection, and there are many projections. Some of the projections say that population will stabilize at a lower rate. Some say it will stabilize at a higher rate, and much depends on what we do with respect to population, and whether we do find ways to empower women to have knowledge about contraception and have access to contraception and have education. That it's well known that that actually is a key factor that can reduce birth rates. So we shouldn't take as a given that population is going to be 9.3 billion by 2050. We have to think about what are the different pathways. And similarly, that consumption, we look at how consumption patterns are changing, and that many of the emerging economies are adopting the American-style diet. But that's not a good thing, because the American-style diet is killing us. Do we really want it to kill other people too? So we should really be questioning the American-style diet and trying to change our own model here so that we can be a better model for other people abroad.
Thank you. Bill, let's get you in here. Can you unpack this question about waste, and not necessarily just food waste in production, but distribution systems? Working for the World Bank, you have a good purview of what goes on in international trade and finance and how food moves around the world. Can we unpack that for us a little bit? How is it that we produce enough food, but we don't get it to the right markets?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is an old question, and I think a lot of it has to do with, having the financial means. It's not enough that somebody's producing food somewhere. You have to have the financial means in the importing countries and the purchasing power of the consumers to be able to afford it. Something else that we've been looking at the World Bank is the efficiency of systems, of the marketing systems for transporting grains, for importing grains. I worked for a while in the Middle East, North Africa region, and if you look at global flows of fuel and food, that region is, as everyone knows, a major exporter, the biggest exporter of petroleum, but it's also the biggest importer of food. And one of the reasons why they have high food prices and they still have issues with hunger in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, is because the systems for the port facilities, the systems for importing and transporting food supplies are inefficient and time-consuming. But I think it's also important to not underestimate the importance of policy. A lot of what happened during, especially the food price crisis, was that a lot of the countries that were typically exporting to North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, were countries in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, places like Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Russia that are typically major exporters of grains in good years. They had droughts, food prices were increasing, they were afraid of the impact on their own populations, and so they put in place export bans, and that had a major disruptive effect on global food systems, and made it very difficult for countries that have been relying on food imports from that region to get enough food to feed their population. So I think it's important on a global level to keep the flow of food open and maintain policies that allow for food to get to the places where it's needed most.
Right. So it's not necessarily technological advances, increased production, that is necessarily going to solve the global hunger crisis, if you will. It's more, there's more infrastructure issues and policy, and really what you're talking about, Fred, like whole paradigm shifts of our economic system as a whole, rather than just can we make more drought-resistant wheat genes. So I wonder what you guys think about that. Where should we focus our capital? Though, as an investor and as we have intellectual and social capital here, how can we focus that to get at those problems? And Fred, you look like you're going to.
Yeah, well, Jeremy Grantham already wrote about that, and he's one of our major investment consultants, and he does a regular newsletter, and his April 2011 newsletter was entitled "Time to Wake Up. The day of unlimited natural resources and cheap prices is over forever." And he was saying to his investors, the people who want to make money on their money, if you want to make money on your money in the future, you can't do it by the old playbook. You have to look at it in terms of what are the kinds of natural capital and the kinds of social capital that we're going to need to support our financial capital. And if we don't do that, increasingly you're not going to make money on your money, because you're going to lose all of those resources which are necessary to a healthy economy.
So Claire, can you come in there? So the field of ecological economics, trying to put ecosystems in the framework of ecological or natural capital. Where do you see that as a state of the art today?
Where do I see it as a state of the art?
Where is the state of the art of that? Because if what Fred is suggesting, that we need to put a value on what you're suggesting is ecological intensification.
I'm not sure
How do we do that?
He was saying we need to put a value on it. I think he's saying we need to value it, which is a really big difference. So putting a value on it is saying this is how much it is worth in the marketplace. But if instead we change that just a little bit and we say we value it, we know that it's really important. We understand how important natural capital is for the long-term maintenance of us as a species, because we're talking about it, we're talking right now about food production. We understand that we can't continue to do food production without maintaining these support systems. That's all we really need to know. We don't need to necessarily put a price on it. We need to create policies that promote that kind of the use of agroecological practices. And right now, I think we have a lot of policies that really push against rather than help to support. That growers that are trying to do this are often fighting against things that aren't helping them.
Bill, as an economist, how do you manage that or navigate that issue about we need to value something, but yet the market and global economies really want to price it? How do you deal with that?
Well, I coming back to the earlier question about externalities, I mean, the market has a role to play, but I don't think that, again, we should underestimate the importance of policy and public policy and things that governments can do. One of the things that I think is really exciting about this Agricultural Innovation Prize is that it's trying to encourage transformational innovations and looking not just at inventions or something that can be a successful business. As Harold Schmidt said last night in his comments, an invention isn't necessarily an innovation. And I was really encouraged when I got here and I was judging yesterday and I saw the different criteria, and there were all these criteria on what are the environmental impacts of these proposals, what are the social impacts of these proposals, what is the potential to scale it up. And I think there were a lot of exciting ideas here, a lot of interesting inventions. One thing I think going forward that I'd like to see is some more thinking about the policy side of things and the incentive side of things, and working with, as an economist, working with economists and colleagues from the social sciences to see what does it take to get this invention accepted by society and to get it scaled up. I was talking yesterday, another, I think, exciting thing about this event is the ability to meet people from all sorts of different aspects of of agriculture and the agri-food system. And yesterday I spent the day with John Jacobs. I think he's left now, but a dairy farmer from Wisconsin, and who's very forward-looking. And he told me the story about how he's got over 3,000 dairy cows, a lot of manure. He was interested in putting in biodigesters and generating electricity, but they create a lot more generate a lot more electricity than what he can use on his farm. So in order for that to make economic sense, he has to be able to sell it back to the grid, back to the utility. Well, the utility doesn't have an interest in hooking him up to the grid, because that's not how they make money. They make money by generating electricity themselves. So in order to get that utility to be open and to be efficient in terms of hooking farmers up to the grid so that their biodigesters can feed back into the system, you need some kind of public intervention, public policy to encourage those utilities to do that. Some of the other ideas that we heard about yesterday were technically interesting. There were some, technically extremely impressive, honestly, but there were some questions we had on our panel about would they be accepted in the target society, whether in sub-Saharan Africa or India. And I think that it would be beneficial for a lot of the teams to work with some colleagues from the social sciences who can help answer some of those questions, so that you're not just looking at the technical feasibility of these ideas, but also the cultural and the economic feasibility.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add just a thing to that? Because I want to disagree a little bit on that with regard to the example of the digesters. Because again, you have to think in terms of whole systems. And the idea of having a digester to use your manure to generate electricity on a short-term basis looks really good. But that only works as long as you have the concentration of manure. And you're only going to have the concentration of manure as long as you have the concentration of animals. And having the concentration of animals is absolutely dependent on cheap grain. And just as an example, when crude oil went to $147 a barrel back in 2007 and 2008, hog farmers in Iowa with these concentrated hog operations were losing $20 a hog. You can't do that very long into the future. So you can imagine a future where you have invested in all these digesters, but you can't have the concentration of animals anymore, and you don't have the manure. They're going to have this technology sitting there and not being able to use it. And I'm not saying necessarily that that's an accurate prediction, but it's a real possibility. So again, I think we have to think about not only how we develop new technologies to use our current resources, but also how do we begin to think about food production systems that operate on a lot less energy, because the future that we're facing is not just alternative energy, but the transition we're making is from stored concentrated energy, which is what fossil fuels are, to current diffuse energy. And your energy return on energy invested is always going to be less when you're dependent on current diffuse energy. So this is again why I think that these systems that are based on self-renewing capacity, and this was an insight which Aldo Leopold, which is known to all of you around here, had way back in the 1940s, when he said that the key issue was the health of the land. And what he meant by health land, as he said, was the capacity of the land for self-renewal. And by land, he didn't just mean the real estate out there. He meant the entire biotic community. So how do we design systems so that the entire biotic community is as self-renewing as possible? That reduces your energy input. It increases your productive capacity with far less energy. Those are the kinds of things that, and the thing is, we know how to do most of that. There's wisdom from the past that goes back to Sir Albert Howard, Liberty Hyde Bailey. There's all kinds of information that's there. And I think that's the kind of transition that, in terms of our ag innovations for the future, that we need to look at. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to be constantly in a situation where the costs of all of these things. And right now, you talked earlier about externalizing, and we externalize a lot of these costs. And Jules Preddy did a study in Great Britain, 15 years ago now, where he looked at all of the costs that we're externalizing in our current food system. And then if we were to internalize that, what would that do to the cost in a typical supermarket? He discovered it would increase the cost of food by 40%. Now, those externalized costs, we still end up paying at some point because they're costs to the system. And if you just look at that in terms of how we have separated our food production from our health care, our food production now, we're spending a little less than 10% of our disposable income on food, but we're now spending 18% of our GDP on healthcare. And the healthcare professionals that I'm talking to are telling me that they project that by the year 2050, we'll be spending 25% of our GDP on healthcare. And at that point, the system simply becomes dysfunctional. And we know that the food that we eat has a lot to do with the health that we have. And so these are some of these systems issues that we really have to address, I think, as we want to look at the kind of ag innovations that we need to be thinking about.
Did you want to say something, John?
Yeah, I just wanted to make 2 points. The one, when we initially started this conversation, was about valuing externalities versus pricing them. And I think I come from a business background and trained in kind of economics, and so as a result, I deal a lot with business people. I think there is something to be said for putting a price on these things, and actually looking at the way we evaluate businesses on a triple bottom line perspective. And there has actually been some work in my field in sustainability. This is something that some companies have taken on as their goal. Puma is actually a company, it's quite large, European-based, that worked with an organization called True Cost to put a price on their products, their sneakers and whatnot, going all the way down to the source to where they initially generate the materials to create their products, and came up with a really high price tag that, while it's not incorporated into the investment decision making, it is a demonstration of the amount of externalities that exist in the system that aren't currently a part of it. So it goes back to this conversation we're having about how do you actually value it. And I think, in our current market-driven economy, the capitalist economy we live in, we value things based on price, a lot of it. And there's other values that we have too. And is it right to put the price on it? Is it right to, what's the right way to actually incorporate it into the balance sheet or the income statement or however you want to do it? But we do need to start thinking along those lines of not just economic, but social and environmental impacts. And so to that second point I wanted to create is where do we invest? I would love to see more investment in agronomic research. It's boring, it's not sexy, it's all about soil and water and biodiversity, but it takes years, and we need to invest in that now. I think we're very focused on the quick fix, the silver bullet, what's gonna get us there the fastest. And these problems are much more complex and much more entrenched. And so I'd love to see much more multivariate analyses, research being done on those systems-based and putting a true kind of systems-based research approach, as opposed to just focusing on the single outcome of yield. How much yield does this get me? I want to see soil, water, biodiversity, farm impacts, farm labor, as part of the equations by which we evaluate success.
Great, thank you. What I think we should do now is, I have a whole, 3 pages of lists of questions that I could ask these guys, but I think it would be more exciting for you guys if you guys could interact and have some questions as well, because I think that's really where we can best add value. Sarah. Why don't we start with Fred on GMO?
Can you repeat the question?
GMOs.
Yeah.
Can you give us some information about scientific facts about yield, and then also some facts about marketing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there have been a number of studies that have been done now comparing production in places in Europe, for example, where they've not used GMOs, with production in this country where we have used them. And all of that data indicates that the yields are basically equal. So to make the claim that GMOs are somehow increasing yields, even when you look at USDA's data on this, is pretty hard to substantiate now. The other thing is that we also have made the claim that it has reduced pesticide input, and that was true in the early part of using Roundup-ready crops. But now, as resistance is building up, we're using so much more that we're actually now using more pesticides than we did before. And this is not to say that genetic science and genetic manipulation isn't important, And this is not my area of expertise. I'm totally dependent on a whole group of colleagues who are close friends of mine who are geneticists. And they're all telling me now that the whole field of genetics is changing rapidly. And this whole notion that you can put a single gene into the genome and then have, a substantial, reliable, new kind of organism is simply not true. Because genes get turned on and off in a system depending on the involvement with the environment, et cetera. And so this is now referred to as epigenetics. And there are a lot of resources which are coming out around this. One of the books which I like a lot is a book of essays put together by Krimsky and Gruber called Genetic Explanations, Sense and Nonsense. And one of the things and some of the essays, these are all essays from geneticists, some of them going back to the 1970s, where some of the geneticists already began to realize this shift which was taking place in our understanding of genetics. And then they do the final chapter in this, and they say, so how come, in the academic community, we're still promoting the single gene approach, and the public press is still promoting the single gene approach? And he said the reason is because when you look at the complexity of biological systems, it's hard to get funding for that. If you say, I want to get a grant, to explore how complex genetics is so we can better understand that, you're not going to get it. If you're going to apply for a grant to find the gene that solves the problem of heart disease, you're going to get a grant. And they say in the public media, the same thing is true. If you want to publish a story about the complexity of biological systems, you're not going to get published. If you got a story that says, well, we got somebody working on how to find the gene that causes heart disease and we're going to solve the problem for the future, you'll get it published. So we have this kind of cultural issue that is preventing us from really advancing in terms of what the scientific community is discovering within its own field. And what we need to understand and how we need to think about genetics. So, given all of that, my view as a farmer around genetics, I want to know about genetics, and I want to use the information around genetics as a part of the systems biology thing that I want to create in terms of how I am going to redesign my farming system and the landscape, given the challenges that I mentioned a minute ago in the future. And learning how those systems are going to function at the genetic level is going to be as important, if not more important, than what I know about, crop rotation level and those kinds of things. And here's the other thing that I think is really important, and that is that when we begin to look at these systems at the microbiome level, and here again is where I see as the good news. It wasn't until about a year and a half ago that we started to see stories and we started to see scientific investigations into the microbiome level. Even when you talk about food safety, most of the research around food safety was not done at the level of the microbes. It was done, at the level where we usually look at food safety. Now we're beginning to recognize, as we start to look at the microbiome level, not only in terms of the role that healthy soil can play when you really look at, soil is a living organism. Soil scientists, near as I can tell, can't even come to an agreement about the amount of living systems that are in the soil, except that it's more than there is above the surface of the soil. And some of our soil scientists are saying when you look at the living microbial community in the soil, some are saying there are probably 1 million microbes in a single teaspoonful of soil, and some are saying it could be as much as 3 and 4 billion in a single teaspoonful of soil. And that living community, if you're going to have healthy biological soil, which I think is one of the foundations that we have to look at as we look at this new future, then you're missing a whole part of the picture in terms of really understanding how these systems function. And as I say, the good news is that there is increasingly now soil scientists, healthcare professionals, and others beginning to look at this from the microbiome level, and that's very encouraging.
Bill, yeah, you must have a view of this because you deal with international governments about the marketing of GMO crops into those countries. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, I'd like to approach it from a slightly different perspective. This actually came up in the panel that I was on yesterday, the judging panel, and we actually had one of the proposals that was based on GMO. I don't know if the guys from Dursty are here. Yeah. So, I mean, they've come up with a very different sort of application of genetic modification, which is modifying, and I'll probably get this wrong, Chris, but modifying the bacteria that produce yogurt so that at the same time they produce beta carotene that can be used to treat vitamin A deficiency in children, in particular in India, where 62% of the kids are vitamin A deficient. And if you look at the population there, this is a problem that affects tens or hundreds of millions of children. And Chris and his colleagues assured us that it's safe, and the explanation sounded perfectly reasonable to me. So I don't have the technical background to question that, but I think that that there are other questions that arise in terms of, first of all, the regulatory environment. So whether or not we are convinced that it's safe, is the Indian government convinced that it's safe, and what are the regulatory hurdles that you have to go over in order to get approval to at least pilot the technology in the market? And second of all, from a cultural perspective, are people in India willing to feed this to their children, knowing that it's based on a genetically modified organism? And again, I'm not that familiar with the situation in India, but I understand that there is some resistance there to accepting these things in the market. So for a proposal like that to be successful, I think you have to consider all of these the regulatory, not just the technical, the regulatory environment, the social and cultural environment, and take a real cross-sectoral approach to proposing something like that. So just some of the other aspects I think to be aware of in GMOs.
Thanks. Are there some more questions from the audience? Yes, in the back.
I'm fantastically pleased you asked that question, Sarah, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about genetic engineering. But that's not what my question is about. My question is actually for Shauna. You mentioned the importance of doing research in systems-wide ecological research, as well as genetic and biological research. Who do you think is going to pay for that? Because there's with government sequestration, it's a lot harder for researchers to obtain grant money. They're having to look more towards industry, but a lot of researchers are having great difficulty explaining to industry why what they do is valuable.
Yeah, no, it's exactly, it is a big challenge as we've moved more and more away from public funding toward private funding to address it. It's something we face. I mean, I'm currently working in the organic industry, as you know, where I'm primarily in, and we're very spread thin, if you will, and so as a result, what we're trying to do to address some of the organic economy is to collaborate amongst some of our companies to look for ways to invest. But it's too much of a drop in the bucket, to be honest. We need a greater, cadre of people to be looking at this. So to me, I'm actually interested in how we can, create new financial mechanisms that have funds that start to look at these things. So there are some foundations that are looking at it, but I think that, quite honestly, we will not, as a business, survive. Not just Annie's. Any business survive based on our current system. So there's, to me, an imperative that goes well beyond just a single company. We exist, especially in the food system, on finite resources, right? Agriculture depends on nature. It's by definition, right? By its very existence, it doesn't exist within a factory wall. So we have to be thinking about things throughout the supply chain. So I would love to see investors involved with it, all those who are, where they're putting their money to look to do that. So whether it's venture capitalism, whether it's supply chain collaborations, looking to create ways to identify opportunities. Just a couple months ago, we met with several university deans, several companies in the organic industry to meet with land-grant universities to discuss this issue. Organic, unfortunately, has not gotten a whole lot of love when it comes to the research side, and I think that's it's missing a real key opportunity to look into these things. We have farmers who really need it for one. But also, just there's a whole lot of lessons that can be learned across the board. I'm definitely not one to pit sides against each other. I don't think that's the approach to go when it goes with farming. But I'm looking for collaborations across the scheme. I don't have a specific answer, but we're in the process of doing that ourselves.
I'd like to comment on that, which is really a question for you all. So as a capital markets participant, I would pose to you guys that the money is going to come from you, right? Because if you look at the way the financial services system works, is that asset owners, such as yourself, if you own a mutual fund, or if you're a student at a university and that university has an endowment, you are asset owners. So what do asset owners do? Asset owners hire asset managers, like a company like mine. We invest that money in companies like Annie's, right? Full disclosure, we're not invested in Annie's. But and then once we're investors on your behalf, we can then raise shareholder resolutions to this company to say, what are you doing about the sustainability of your business? I invested as a fiduciary, the money on my client's behalf in your company. I want to make sure that you're there for the future. And then they have to respond. And then what do they do in response? They'll invest more money in R&D into these areas. So the money is going to come from you. And you all or your parents all have mutual funds or funds in Swiss bank accounts. I don't know where your money is, but I'm sure there is money there that is active. And money is politics, and that money has a voice, and it needs to be part of this conversation. In a different part of the industry today, right now, lots of campuses are having a whole campaign around fossil fuel divestment. When you guys go back to your institutions, look to see if there's an organization on your campus doing this. Likelihood is that there is. That same campaign organization can take on the food issue, that get the endowments to start holding the companies that they are invested in, or at least through their asset managers, accountable, and get them to be more transparent about what they're doing around sustainability issues such as water, climate change, and just supply chain. Like if I was an investor in Annie's, I'd be very concerned about what their supply chain is. How are their farmers actually producing cheese that goes into the mac and cheese? And full disclosure, I actually am a customer of Annie's because I have little kids. So, so I put it back to you guys. You guys have to take the reins and use your dollars as votes as well. So that's my little speech for the day. Yes, Mr. Leclerc. Oh, I'm sorry. Professor Jarvis had his hand up. Okay. Yeah.
So,
Rob.
I mean, a lot of sustainable food, organic food, it's such as wellness food for the 1%. The joke is, you go to Whole Foods, it's called food culture. Can the sustainable food movement?
Sorry. Yeah, okay, I'll step back. So just briefly, so can the sustainable food movement fulfill the needs of not just the 1%, because they do have much higher margins, in particular allowing them to operate, giving them sort of flexibility to have more control over their supply chain, higher standards and whatnot. Do you see the sustainable and organic food movements being able to supply food in a humane way, meaning it doesn't cost as much as it does to the rest of the population?
Well, I mean, I would take issue with it being for the 1%. I think it's a lot broader than that. But I hear what you're saying in terms of, affordability, and it's definitely an area that those of us who work in the industry are very acutely aware of. I think that unfortunately, though it's not a part of our system, we are taking in a lot of those externalities that others don't have to. And I think to further the point, and Bill had addressed policy issues, we have a very distorted policy system that encourages bad behavior that is not accounted for and not priced into the system. So to me, it's a much bigger systems issue. I would like to think that we are more affordable organic. I realize for some that's not the case, but it truly is an area where we strive to provide a better product, but also are looking to, there is a price premium on it, and we recognize that, but it's accounting for prices that others externalize. So it's when we talk about it from this issue, we can kind of philosophically address it, but that doesn't get to those who need it most. And so I think, one of the ways that we do things working with school gardens, we do things working in agricultural research and investments, other ways to try and regenerate income through other areas, but right now, what's interesting for Annie's is we are well outside the natural market channel. At this point, we're actually more heavily weighted on the mainstream channel, whether it be mainstream grocery or discount groceries. So we think that there's actually opportunity there to continue to grow our presence, and that there's actually a desire for it as well. So I don't think that it's just those who have money that are seeking better attributes for themselves and for their children. I think it goes much broader than that. And so to me, that's what we need to kind of encourage and continue to, and look for ways to continue to change the system overall to ensure that it's still there in the future, that our supply is still there. But it's certainly an area that we're aware of, but I do think that there's work being done.
Professor Jarvis.
I was struck by the comments from, say, Fred and Claire, emphasizing the importance of, say, soil biota ecology, and thinking how much really that depends on essentially fundamental research. And thinking back to Harold's presentation last night, where, as Bill indicated, again, there was the emphasis on fundamental research as the basis for much of the innovation that comes subsequently. So here we have a really exciting set of presentations about innovations, many of which are silver bullets, but not all of which are silver bullets, a number of which are looking at more fundamental issues. But much of what we would like to do in the future clearly depends on fundamental research, which has taken place primarily in universities around the world. And we know that university research, funds for university research in agriculture have been cut back significantly over recent decades. And so here we are talking about the need for more agricultural innovation to solve really fundamental problems dealing with climate change and the soil exhaustion, increasing cultivation, etc. Bill goes back to policy. That's an important element of policy. Something I think when we have agricultural innovation prizes, we need to come back and say to our policymakers and to our constituents, the public as a whole, that if we're going to really make this work in the longer run, to have the innovations that we'd like to have, we need the basic research as well. And we're looking primarily at private goods in the innovation prize as opposed to public goods, and those public goods are really essential as well. We need some way to push for those.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi. So you guys were making a comment about changing paradigm. How do you see the agricultural subsidies coming into play with this? You're talking about money and everything. This country, you got to subsidize food if you're going to stay in power. So what's going to happen in the future with subsidies? They're huge.
Bill, do you have a view on that? I know, Shauna, you have a view on the farm bill. I think we all have opinions on the farm bill. We'll start with Bill because he mentioned policy a couple times.
The funny thing is that ironically, even though I come from the U.S. and I studied here, I spent so much of my time working on other countries. I don't know that much about U.S. Farm policy, but it was interesting. Again, I was talking yesterday to, I think I learned more yesterday in one day talking to the John Jacobs, the dairy farmer, than I did from a year of talking to my World Bank colleagues about agriculture. But he said that he doesn't really, he's at a point where he doesn't rely on the subsidies, that his focus is on being innovative, being efficient, being as green as possible, and that in his view, the subsidies were for came into play more for much smaller operations, for more marginal kinds of operations, but that he doesn't rely on them. He doesn't base his decision making on them. There are a lot of indirect subsidies in the system as well that a lot of times people don't even know about. For example, he's getting crop insurance and didn't really realize that that's also subsidized by the federal government. I think for somebody who works on agriculture in developing countries, I think it's a huge global problem that countries in the developed countries, all the OECD countries subsidize their agriculture. It's not just the U.S., the EU, Japan. I mean, they all do it. So, and it really puts developing country farmers at a disadvantage, and that's one area where developing countries could have a potential comparative advantage. And so, I mean, I wish that they would be phased out in the north. Politically, it's extremely difficult, and that's why it hasn't been done, I think.
There's one thing also to be very mindful about subsidies. Let's say you remove subsidies from everything, because everything is subsidized. Well, then what? Right? Then you what? Have an even playing field? Sometimes you have to also be mindful of, you might just get what you want. Did you really want that? Right? I think you had a comment, Claire.
Yeah, I am very sensitive to the point you made, Bill, about these subsidies here causing difficulties for farmers abroad. But the point I wanted to make is that the subsidies that we have here, both the obvious ones and the less obvious, the hidden ones, they don't have any strings attached to them, so we just give them out. What if we had a system where subsidies were tied to incentives for the kinds of behaviors that we would like to support, the kinds of farm management practices that we'd like to support? And in Europe, they have these agri-environment schemes where they provide farmers with payments to do certain practices on their farms. It's to enhance biodiversity on farm fields. It's to create beautiful aesthetic landscapes that reflect the sort of older European traditions and cultures and other things. We have some things like that too. In the Farm Bill, we have our conservation programs, but that's a small component of our Farm Bill programs. These are things like the EQIP and the WIP programs that will provide some funding for certain types of practices. But one of the key differences between those programs and the ones in Europe is that they generally provide only a cost share. It's like a 50% cost share, so the grower has to foot the bill for the rest. And they also require a pretty extensive administrative procedure that some growers just don't want to go there. So what I'm suggesting is that we have those are good. They could be better. And then we have all these other subsidies, much more of the Farm Bill devoted to those, plus the crop insurance program, which is a form of subsidy. And those don't have anything tied to them. So why not have those subsidies be tied to some kind of environmental performance measure?
Shauna, did you have a?
I mean, I could go on about subsidies, but I'm just will say that, as wherever you are, wherever you're coming from, it's really important to be involved and to contact your representatives on the Hill when the Farm Bill comes around. It just passed. Everything's included in this past one, so a little bit for everyone. But I think that we need a much harder look at our Farm Bill system and the subsidies and what we're actually getting out of it. The crop insurance concerns me. We moved from a direct payments to a crop insurance in this past round, and I'm concerned about that, especially with the weather volatility that we're having and what it's actually going to do in terms of cost savings, because I think it's going to be costing us taxpayers a lot more in the next few years. So I think that each of us has a role to play in terms of asking for the system we want to say. There's a lot of special interest when it comes to subsidies, and I will just leave it at that and say get involved.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, great. Yes, Esther.
Thank you very much. Such a great panel. And I know we have had amazing ideas, and you guys are expertise. So what is the one buzzword moving into the future where you see this future trends that you can leave with the students here, that they can go back and think of the ideas and make them better so that when the future comes, these ideas can already be built and make impact? Secondly, I was just thinking, how can we feed off the Agricultural Innovation Prize here from, we know there's a lot of people that deal with agriculture, USAID, the Chicago Council on Global Food Security. How can we, as students who are just getting into the market, but we know we have people who have done it, failed, or or succeeded, have them mentor these students so that their ideas really fit on what's going on, and they can be scaled both nationally and internationally. Thank you.
Okay, so I think what we could do is just make a closing remark, and I'll dovetail what Esther just asked as kind of like what our final question of our list was what is the one word or one concept that still gives you hope that we're going to continue to move forward in the future in a positive, more sustainable light? I'll start with you, Fred.
You want the one word or responding?
One word, but that encapsulates what you see as hopeful.
Okay. Hopefulness for me is about soil. That's the critical component, I think. And we know from a lot of evidence that if you have biologically healthy soil, then you're going to be addressing many of the future challenges, including energy costs and climate change and all of that. So if I had one thing I could do throughout the world, would be to put in place the motivations to restore the biological health of soil. And I think that kind of gets to what you were asking, and it's a great question. I think that one of the things that, or I should say, one of the people that inspired me, because I always thought in my early life that my mission was to change people, and it didn't work out that well, but that's what I thought my mission was. And then when I read Jared Diamond and his intensive research of past civilizations, and he came up with a relatively simple conclusion, and that was that those civilizations that anticipated the changes coming at them, recognized the value of their ecological capital, and got a head start preparing for those changes, were the ones that tended to survive. Those that failed in that exercise were the ones that tended to collapse. And when I read that, I thought, I don't have to change people. It's getting ready for the changes that are coming. And it really changed the way I think things, and the way I devote my own time and energy now is, we know, as I mentioned earlier, some of those changes that are coming at us. So how do we begin to encourage, and this is why soil is so important, the recognition of the value of our ecological capital? Let me just say, there's one other resource that I would recommend if you haven't read it. There's a paper version of the book just came out earlier this year called Food Systems Failure. And it's a series of essays that came out of a conference in New Zealand, where people were asked to address the issue of what caused the food crisis of 2007 and 2008. Was this an aberration, or is it a bigger kind of problem? And the conclusion they all came to was food systems failure. And the basic issue on the food systems failure, which they agreed on, is that we now treat food as a commodity, just a thing. And therefore, we invest in it as a financialization. We invest in terms of speculation. Where's the price of corn going to go next year? And then we use our investment.
Great.
And it was that notion.
I think we have to move on because the judges are back and everyone is waiting for their announcement. So, Bill, one word.
Okay, one word. My word is cool.
Cool. That's right. Everything is really
not just coolified. That's cool. But for me, what I take away from this, one of the things is, I work at a place where I'm in the minority as somebody who works on agriculture. I'm constantly dealing with macroeconomists and big infrastructure specialists who think that agriculture is kind of, backwards and not necessarily that important. And it's always kind of an uphill battle to explain to people that agriculture is important, and not only that, but it's something that's worth investing in. And when I was growing up, agriculture wasn't always the coolest topic, and I kind of came into it indirectly. But I think a lot of things have changed for a number of reasons. And I'm just really encouraged by what I've seen here. People coming from different disciplines. People, 3 teams from the MIT Business School. I mean, these guys should be out there, coming up with the new social network or something. And instead, they're interested in agriculture. I think that's really exciting. And a number of venture capitalists that I met here who are, instead of investing in Silicon Valley, they want to invest in agriculture. And so, something that I take away going back to the World Bank is that agriculture is cool.
Claire.
Well, definitely being here has been really inspiring, and I thank you all for showing me all the things that I've learned yesterday and today. But just to talk about one thing from outside, one thing that really inspires hope in me is a large-scale social movement happening across the world called La Via Campesina that promotes the idea of the food sovereignty issue and is really building the capacity of growers around the world to utilize agroecological techniques.
Great, thanks. Shauna?
And I would just say, it's been really inspiring to be here with all of you, and you have amazing ideas, and I encourage you to keep running with them. There's so many great ways to share knowledge these days, so you know what they are, take advantage of them. The concept that I really love right now is it combines ecology and economics, and it's coined right now under the term circular economies, and you can look it up. There's Ellen MacArthur Foundation has recently released a report on it, and it's supported by the likes of the World Economic Forum and McKinsey Consulting, which means to me that there actually might have some legs here. But it's the idea of you're going away from a take, make, waste society to a take, make, and reuse. So there is no waste in the first place, and no toxicities and renewable energy. And to me, I'm excited by that, and how could we use those ideas to create new innovations?
And my one word is shareholder activism. So great. Thank you very much to the panel. And I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Lunt.
Thank you again very much to the panel. And before we get to the final award ceremony, I just have a couple of logistics announcements. The first, the posters that are up on the poster boards, if you plan on taking those home, please go ahead and take those down after the award ceremony. If you leave them there, they'll be recycled. If you need a taxi, please see Maria over at the registration desk where all the buses unloaded. And the bus will be departing after the awards ceremony and the pictures and the other couple things that we have to do. And as soon as they get here, we can load them up and get out of and exit this space. If you still have your name tags, please recycle those or deposit them in. There's a box over by the registration desk. They'll be reused. On Monday, probably not before, you shall be receiving a survey about the kind of this process in general, what you learned, what we can improve on, what was good, what we might want to do differently next year. So we really appreciate you putting just a little bit of thought and some time into those surveys. Right after the announcements, we're going to ask everybody to follow, we're going to ask the finalists and the grand prize winner to follow Marianne, who is over here, who will be helping us with pictures out in the atrium. We understand there's a couple of teams who will be staying in town another night. We think it's a great idea if you are interested to hang out with each other, maybe come up with next year's entry ideas already. The Wisconsin Memorial Union Terrace is just a couple blocks down. You can go sit on the lake and enjoy some refreshments. Also, the fried cheese curds are the best at the old-fashioned restaurant. That's all I have to say. So, Molly, to you.
Well, this is the moment we've been waiting for. And very soon we will announce all our winners and identify the grand prize winner. But I want to just observe something I think we all saw this morning, which is a really interesting array of people and projects who had a chance to pitch to this very distinguished panel of judges. And I found that really moving, just to see the faces and the ideas and the passions from very small scale efforts in the U.S. to very large scale efforts and focus all over the world. And I'm delighted to see the diversity of focus in agriculture. I think we heard in this last discussion a lot of emphasis on systems, and I'm thrilled to see the degree to which that kind of thinking has really permeated your thinking. I think it's critically important, as our panelists and others have said, and we can't wait to see what you propose next year. I'd also just like to thank each of you who've brought a bit of where you came from here. To the Hawaiians especially, I think there may be one word that beautifully describes the spirit that's infused this whole thing, and that is aloha. And so I'm grateful to each and every one of you for the attitude you've brought, your good grace, your willingness to invest in this and in your projects and in each other. We really look forward to leveraging that for next year. So, without further ado, after I thank our distinguished panel again of judges and acknowledge David Lizax, Chris Meyer, and Toby Lunt, who've done a magnificent job. And of those three, I have to say, David's been involved the longest, and if David hadn't said, yep, let's do it, I'm not sure we would have gotten over some of those early humps. So especially that partnership has been very important to my ability to contribute. So I would like to call the first $25,000 winner up to the stage to be acknowledged, and that winner is Middlebury Foods. And I hope that you'll have a chance, perhaps one way or the other, to circle back with judges to get feedback from this panel as well. That's a lesson we've taken away from all of you, so please come on up. We're delighted to have you involved. Congratulations. And maybe just move on down the line, because we've got 4 other teams. Am I doing my math right? 4 other teams to announce. Stay right there. Okay. I think we can get you all up here. Okay, now for the second $25,000 winner. It's Ho'oulu Pacific. Congratulations. So we got Vermont and Hawaii. Fruits and vegetables, fish. Come on up. Our third $25,000 winner is Pasture Bird. Come on up. Small scale family farmers from California. Our fourth $25,000 winner is Mighty Meal, 2 ladies and some bugs. Our fifth, I can't do the math. Fifth $25,000 winner is one of my favorite crops on the planet. Focused, it's love grain, teff. say, in 1997, I had the privilege of visiting Ethiopia when teff was virtually unknown outside of Ethiopia. I was part of the McKnight Foundation team that made the first large-scale research investment in teff. There were about 2.5 people on Earth that knew how to pollinate it. You saw those little bitty seeds. And so you have come a long way, and we're thrilled to be able to help you. Thank you. And our grand prize winner, the $100,000 recipient, is Coolify. He's not letting that one get away. Okay, here, come right on up. So again, we will be the first to acknowledge this is our first year. It was incredibly audacious to even try. We thank Mary from the very beginning and Robbie for their vision to make this happen. Very powerful. USDA for their cooperation and support. And we really hope we'll be around next year to offer improvements to the process and to celebrate the community that you all create. We have some people on the stage, but again, every single one of you can move your own ideas forward, but can more importantly, by our standards, move this community forward. You're all fellows of the Agricultural Innovation Prize, and we can't wait to see what's going to happen next. So thank you again for coming to Madison, Wisconsin. Thank you for your investments of all types, your willingness to travel. Thanks again to our distinguished panel of judges this morning and all of the judges who worked so hard yesterday as well. And again to the WID staff and our students that made this happen. Again, Toby, you've done a great job, and all the students. So with that, we're going to close our program. Wish you all a beautiful spring day here in Madison, Wisconsin. The terrace is not to be missed if you got a minute. And those cheese curds are special. And we hope you'll travel safely home, and we'll see you again next year. Thank you so much. Congratulations.